Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar, Digital Collections Management Fundamentals. A quick note about myself if you're new to our webinars. I am Rachel Christine Woody. I am the founder and director of Relicura. I have 20 years in archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. And in addition to being a business owner and consultant, I'm an author, speaker, and people first advocate. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. A link to this recording and links to the resources that we mentioned will be sent via email to everyone who registered. So while we'll share the links in the chat with you in real time during the premiere, you will also have an email with those links. This session is pre-recorded so that I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you, and also so that we can have questions and answers as well as discussion in the chat while the webinar is in premiere mode. That said, while we're in premiere mode, please feel free to share your own examples, resources, or any questions you have in the chat box. I will note that we are using YouTube Player, so YouTube Player will require that you have a YouTube or Google account in order to participate. Now, because the webinar is being provided via the YouTube platform, you do have access to all of the usual YouTube toolbar tools and should be able to minimize or maximize your screen depending on your device, as well as activate closed captioning. And then finally, just please remember that the content I present is my own intellectual property and is subject to copyright. So for our contents today, we are, of course, tackling a pretty large topic. We will be focusing on the fundamentals aspect of digital collections management because, of course, there are many areas that are very worthy of a deeper technical dive. So before we do those webinars, we're going to start off with this one that's sort of a Digital Collections 101. Some of this content you may already know, which is great. Some of this content may be brand new, which is also very common, and don't feel out of the loop on that one. We intend to cover digital files and just setting some definition parameters around how we are using that particular language for today's conversation. We will talk about digital collection management fundamentals, like the actual acts or activities of digital collections management, because that piece then informs how we talk about the systems available to us, which is the Collections Management System, CMS, the Digital Asset Management System, DAMS, or preservation systems, which doesn't quite have its own unified or agreed upon acronym just yet. I've seen PAMS, which is adorable for it to rhyme with DAMS. For today, we're going to call it preservation systems. Then we'll sort of start bringing it home. We'll go through considering the choices in terms of not all of us can afford nor want more than one system. And so what do we do when only part of our digital collections management needs are met? And then we'll have time for a couple questions that were sent ahead of time, as well as any questions you have here, and then leave you with some resources to tide you over before we dive into more detailed and technical content. Quick disclaimer. So for some of these slides and examples that we'll talk about, I will mention some specific products or services or tools. That is by no means necessarily an endorsement of those particular tools or systems. And if I don't mention a tool or system, that doesn't necessarily mean that I am opposed to or do not like them. Merely just mentioning a couple just to give you a sense of what's a preservation system versus like what's a digital asset management system. And then also to keep in mind that every organization is different collections, different sizes, different budgets, different audiences, and just different needs. Which means that one system may be great for Museum A and not be so great for Museum C. So just keep in mind there's no one size fits all approach, nor is there a perfect system, which we'll talk a little bit more about later today. All right, getting into it, digital files. So digital files is the phrase we're going to use for most of this conversation because it is much more straightforward in its phrasing versus digital assets. For those of you who are more familiar with digital asset management, with digital file management, assets is more typically used. It's obviously the A in the DAMS for digital asset management system. But for our language here today, we're going to talk about it in terms of digital files. With that in mind, digital files can encompass born digital. And if born digital is a new phrase for you, it means essentially that the digital file that you have has never existed previously in a physical form. So for example, if we are creating a digital artwork, that particular artwork piece has only been in its born digital form. It had never existed previously as a physical art piece. So with that, born digital, there's objects and items, which can be a part of our collection, but we can also have born digital files that are considered more of the supporting documents or supporting attachments, thinking about conservation, assessment, and treatment files, thinking about perhaps electronically created and signed accession and acquisition forms, those particular attachments that aren't in themselves the collection item, but are related to the collection item. And then digital surrogates. And digital surrogates come from something being digitized. For example, items need to have existed physically, and an example can be an actual, like a ceramic object, and then it was photographed, and that photograph serves as a digital surrogate for that ceramic piece. If you're in archives, a particular manuscript could be digitized, and therefore the PDF of that digital manuscript is that manuscript's digital surrogate. So as you can see, there are a number of different digital files in terms of what they mean to us as collection stewards. And all of those are subject to or may be impacted by or help to inform the choices we make when we're thinking about digital collections management and ultimately that digital file management piece of it. Okay, getting into the fundamentals piece. So for fundamentals, there are two main areas. There's the digital file management area and there's the digital file preservation area. Digital file management, we're thinking about file storage, the file naming conventions, which quite literally mean the digital files that we have, how, like, what is the file name that we are assigning them and being purposeful and following best practices there, and file organization. For many of us, especially as we've grown up in a computer era, the intent behind how we organize our files may not always be there and may be some more of an organic amassing of files. And when we are thinking about the digital files that are under our stewardship, we need to have a much more structured approach. The digital file preservation piece gets much more technical, and so we will touch on the fundamentals of that aspect, thinking about file backups, digital file version control, and the file health checks. So for digital file management, the first piece is storage. Where are we storing these digital files, whether they be actual born digital collection item files, or they be attachments that go to a collection item, or they're digital circuits of that particular item? Where are we storing these? They can be all over the place, which is quite normal, including our computer locally, including whichever shared department server you may be using, If your particular organization is using a cloud service instead of storing things more locally, it may be contained in things like Google Drive or Dropbox. You may also have an external hard drive, which is very typical of any sort of department that's doing a mass amount of either digitization or in any sort of like audiovisual time-based media creation and management. Or, or you may have things already in your collections management system, your CMS, or your digital asset management system, your DAMS. If you have one or two of those in place, you are also likely uploading those files to those particular systems. Now, what happens is because we're human and we're using these things in a sort of organic and not always intentional way, there is usually quite a bit of redundancy in terms of things being saved locally to the computer and then maybe again to my cloud service or my external drive. And then again, when I upload it to the CMS and or DAMS. And while that is great to have multiple copies, it can also make it very difficult to know where things are in any sort of consistent fashion, and ultimately does serve as even more, creating even more risk points to where our files may be lost and like irreplaceably lost. So while having multiple storage systems is great, we also need to make sure that it's not so many different places they're being stored that we can't find it or it's at risk of being lost. Digital file naming. So this is how we are naming digital files, whether they are born digital files and we're assigning a name to it, or we are doing digitization, which again, we're assigning a name to that particular file. Regardless of what type of digital file they are, they should have a very specific and intentional file name. And some of those best practices to keep in mind when you're creating that file naming convention is to account for collection growth, knowing that you will likely always be adding digital files to your storage system, but also needing to then avoid duplication where there might be an accidental overwriting of files that share the same file name, and that you are naming them in a consistent enough fashion that anybody who comes into your particular department or collection next can immediately figure out where they are by just looking at the digital file name. This can also be very helpful when we provide digital files to a collections management system, for example, and then we need to migrate to a new CMS and the previous CMS didn't do a permanent linking to the object. They did a pathway at which then atrophied. And so all of a sudden you're left with a bunch of orphaned digital files and not necessarily having any idea which records they are supposed to be going to. Part of that risk can be mitigated by having intentional and interpretive digital file names. So there's an example on the left-hand side, and this is typically how I recommend my clients do their file naming conventions. That is to start off with the organization acronym at the beginning, all capitals. It is the only instance where capitals are used because that can be a point of failure elsewhere in the file name. And while it may seem obvious to, I don't need to know the organization acronym, like we work here, why include that? And you include that because oftentimes, in just a few years from now, usually, your files will then also be contributed to some sort of consortia or collaborative database. It may be lended to or be a part of a collaborative project. Several different types of examples that can come up where these files may eventually leave the context of your organization, and having that acronym is essential when it does. So just as best practice, I recommend including it. We use underscores, no spaces. I cannot tell you how many hours and tears have been lost because file names have unexpected or hard to view spaces in them. Don't use spaces, use underscores. The next big portion of this particular file name is the name of the collection. And this is particularly important for archives where there may be multiple types of collections that need to be defined. For that, we have Smith Collection. It's human readable, no capitals, because trying to keep title casing consistent is usually not possible when working with humans. We then have that underscore. We have, in this case, a counter for that particular collection. So this could be accession number for you. It can be whatever sort of like digital number may have been assigned via the inventory. And then for this particular item, there may be two different views of it. So we want a underscore 01 or an underscore 02, depending on if there are different views, front view, back view, that kind of thing. So you can see we are getting several pieces of information about this file from the file name. So I don't even need to necessarily open this file to know that it belongs to the Smith collection and that it's item 1735. So that's just an example and a few reasons why it's so important, and it will, future self will thank you. All right, digital file organization. So this particular area is another area we have control over usually. And this is for when we are saving files either locally to the computer, the external hard drive, if we're creating folder hierarchies in like Google Drive or Dropbox, anywhere where you can determine the actual file hierarchy in your storage area of choice. And what we want is for it to mirror real life organization, especially if it is representing real physical collections. Again, that's to help indicate to the viewer where this particular collection item lives, both in a physical and digital sense. And we can use the folder hierarchy to help delineate relationships. For example, on the left-hand side here, if it's an archives collection, we have the organization name acronym at that top. We have a breakdown of that first level, which is going to be correspondence, photographs, and then research and manuscripts. And then you see a further breakdown of the correspondence digital folder into A through C correspondence and then D through F correspondence. So in this particular file structure, I can see that there are several folders of correspondence organized by the correspondent name, all contained in the correspondence section of this collection. Similarly, if you were working with an object collection, say you were working in the ceramics area, so the ceramics folder would be like your top level folder for the hierarchy. And then if you have ceramics from different geographical areas, you can further subdivide that way, and then place the digital files as appropriate into your folders. So just another way to help convey information in a very consistent and intentional manner. Now the digital file preservation piece of this. So this gets into a more technical area where it's not necessarily style guide choices. It is more about tools or system choices. So things to be aware of here when we're thinking about our digital files, we are thinking about the health of the digital file. And when we think about that, there are two main types of failure or types of areas where we can get file loss. The first main area is digital file integrity. So this is the file itself and whether or not it's losing bits of itself as it gets transferred or opened and worked on. It can be the file itself being corrupted by a bad program operation. It happens less now that technology is better for us, thank goodness. But any sort of thing that could happen to the file to render it useless to you. The second major area is digital file access. So this is less about the file itself and more about our ability to access it. For example, if we have a Word doc on a flash drive or an external hard drive, and that hard drive or flash drive then fails, gets broken, gets lost, you've lost access to that file. Now, that wasn't necessarily because the file was corrupted or not healthy. It was because there was an issue with how you were trying to access it. The actual mechanism of that access. So something for us to think about as we walk through whether it is about the file itself, the file integrity, or the file access. Thinking about digital file backups first. So thinking about storage, thinking about how those things are being backed up. This part we want to make sure is intentional. And while there's some redundancy, there are a few other things to keep in mind. So thinking first and foremost, that redundancy piece, if things are being saved locally to my computer, I want to also make sure that there's some sort of tool or system that is running in the background that is backing up those files as they live on my computer and as I am working on them. That way it lives on my computer, but it also lives somewhere else wherever I have set that backup to take place and be stored. Sometimes that can be an external hard drive in the local room. Sometimes that can be with a Silicon Valley option like Dropbox, and it's being saved to their cloud and their servers. So having it in two very different places is usually ideal. Speaking of which, the goal is to have 2, preferably 3, different geographic locations represented in where you are saving your files. For example, if you are doing external drive, hard drive type backups, you will want one with you, of course, locally. You will want one somewhere else like somewhere different in the state or province that you are in. And then you are going to want one that is nowhere near your particular geographic region. The reason why that is because of both nature and man-made disasters, theft, flooding, hurricanes, fire, so many different ways where you may be backing it up, but if you're keeping that backup local in the same building, that's not good because that both your local and that backup will be gone if there was a fire in your building. Similarly, if you save it and it's at someone's house, but it's still in the same county, if there's flooding or a hurricane, you have the risk of having that backup being lost, just like the local copy, which is why you need it in an entirely different geographical region that is not experiencing the same sort of natural or man-made disasters. Also, scheduled and consistent. Whether you are working with a system that can schedule this for you, if not already done automatically, making sure that you are consistent in triggering the run for that backup process. So there are some great tools out there that can help you do that backup, but it requires you being the one to initiate that process. Another thing to keep in mind is regular hardware replacement. So this gets to that digital file access piece we were talking about on the previous slide. We are hoping to mitigate loss against technical obsolescence and just wear and tear and natural death cycles of that hardware. Servers aren't they're not made to last forever. Hard drives, CDs, flash drives, all of those, even the best ones, have a lifespan, and those lifespans are remarkably short for it being a well-made piece of equipment. So, for example, thinking about external drives, those maybe have 5 years on them. Most of the time I see them working for 2 to 3 years. 5 years is a good stretch, and then you really need to replace that external drive. Similarly with computer servers, they're getting better nowadays, but again, 5 years, and then it starts getting super risky in terms of how long their lifespan is for that particular server. As an asterisk here, that's part of the reason why it's so nice to work with some sort of cloud-based third-party system, or having servers that are maintained by somebody other than your organization, because then it is their responsibility to make sure that the hardware is cycled out on a regular basis, and that are often managed and monitored quite intensely, because that is the thing that they are selling. And then finally, software audited and tested. This is when you are setting up systems for automated backup, if you're setting up regular scheduled backup copy for your external drives, for example, making sure that it is set up correctly, doing a test run, opening it, making sure that all of your files were backed up appropriately. I can't tell you how many times clients have had something set up for them and nobody did a test run and come to find out that while they had a backup system supposedly in place for 2 years, it was not actually doing any backups. And so when they needed it, it wasn't there. So please, please, please just test it and then test it frequently, because any sort of software update, any sort of changes to where files are, any of those, depending on the tool you're using, can throw that sort of backup system off in terms of where it goes, where it finds the files, how successful it is, etc. So just please make sure that you are auditing and testing frequently. All right, digital file version control. This is another important aspect of digital file preservation when we are thinking about preservation best practice versus just like file management and use. We want to make sure that we have the original file, so like pristine original file, either as it was created, born digital, or as it's come out as the result of a digitization process. We want to name that file, we want to put that file in its permanent place, and then hopefully never touch it again. From that file, we would like a derivative, so a working file. This particular file is the one that we're going to open. It's the one that we're going to edit if we want to edit it for some reason. It's the one that we're going to send off to have reproductions made, what have you. That's the one that's going to be the main access copy for our work. And then depending on what type of institution you are a part of, there may be a concept of a reference file. So this may be a lower quality file, smaller file size that's created because it's being contributed to a database, because it's being published online on the museum website. And so there needs to be that lower quality, lower file size type document. And then thinking about the digital file health checks. So we talked a bit about the hardware and to making sure that like the servers are healthy, that they're being switched out regularly, and thinking about the health of the hardware. Similarly, we need to think about the health of the digital files themselves. Part of that is thinking about their particular file format. For example, file format, when I say that, that means like the end suffix part of the file name. So that's the .doc for doc, that's .pdf, that's .tiff. Those file formats, some are more naturally inclined towards better preservation by their very nature, or perhaps they're part of a software package that is open source, and so the likelihood of being able to access them in the long term is much higher. There are several considerations when thinking about file formats, and so making sure that we're making the best long-term access and long-term preservation choice when we choose those file formats. We also want to check our checksums, and checksums is a weird word, at least for my brain, but it essentially is a tool that helps to look at a file, be able to assign that file a unique ID, and have a sense for all the little bits in that file. I've heard it described as a fingerprint for that file. It is completely unique, and it's something that we can use to help check against later on to make sure that that file is still healthy. For example, if you are doing the concept of the original file that's pristine and you don't touch it, it's the preservation copy, and you have the working file, we want to make sure that that preservation copy retains the entirety of its fingerprint, the entirety of its bits. And so maybe annually we do a checksum against it to make sure that it matches the same fingerprint it gave us last year. So it's a nice like comparison check to make sure that that file still has everything it should have and that it is still healthy. There are some great tools out there that can help do that. Some systems do that naturally in the background. It just sort of depends on what you can afford. And then finally, ability to open and view. And so this is getting to like file version obsolescence in terms of there is software that we used to use 10, 15, 20 years ago that we no longer use, like WordPerfect. There can be documents you have that are the WordPerfect format. WordPerfect no longer exists. And so you will need to migrate that obsolete file form into a different one, either doc or PDF, in order to be able to continue to access that particular file. So these are several different things to think about when we're thinking about our digital files, which can make it overwhelming when you have a lot of digital files, but are all very important pieces to being able to access that copy later on. All right, now that we've talked about fundamentals, we're going to get into the different types of systems and where they come into play when we think about digital file management, and ultimately like the question of what systems do we need, and do we need multiple? Collections management. So this was first and foremost about collection data, certainly when it started out with card catalogs. Since then, we have added digital files to it. So in addition to collection data, we have digital surrogates of that collection item. We also have the digital files that are attachments, supporting files for that particular item or collection. Collections management also helps us with the management and facilitation of location capture. It also helps do, if you have a CMS in place, that vendor will do data backups and quite often the asset backups as well. And if you have a vendor with you, security, or an IT department that does security. And I highlight security specifically because for us in our collections area, can have a tendency to take security for granted in terms of security against theft, loss, or corruption. But I'm sure many of you heard about TMS as one of the collections management systems that was hacked, and its data for all, not all, but like a majority of some of its big clients were held hostage as a result of a security issue, security breach. So security is very important to keeping access, quite literally, to your files and your data. Digital file management. So thinking about digital file management and the digital asset management system, we want the ability to add, to edit, and to manage. We also want to be able to do multi-location storage. So thinking about not just on my computer, not just in the building or the county, but having 2 to 3 geographic locations. We needed to do backups and versioning for our digital files to help with maintaining that digital file integrity, as well as making sure that it's able to continue to be open and it's not going into obsolescence. We also need security, and usually more nuanced and greater ability to control access to specific areas of our files and specific functions that may be available in the system, because most of the time the data and file loss that happens is human error. Also, some data capture, a focus on data about the file versus the collection information. So unlike the CMS, for the digital asset management system and for our digital file management, we are much more focused on the data for that particular file. So when was it created? On what sort of software? When was it created? Was it altered at all? When was it altered? That kind of thing. And then sometimes there's a connection to a CMS to provide public access. As you saw in the CMS, there's already some aspect of file management and security, but there's not nearly the extent of management options, let alone preservation, happening. And then similarly, when we're thinking about file management in a file management system, it's much more focused on that management piece versus the access piece. So while there's some overlap, it's also missing some key things as to why we wouldn't just choose this system. And then for the actual digital preservation piece, so thinking about those digital files with preservation as the primary focus. So we need the ability to have those original files with no editing or management. We want to be able to park them somewhere once and for all, and then be able to not have to worry about them. We need multi-location storage and constant rotation. So yes, similar to the digital asset management sort of systems where we want that sort of backup, but it is even more important here, especially with that constant rotation of where those things are being stored in a physical sense. Thinking about backups and versioning. So again, similar to digital asset management, but having that preservation lens, it's going to be much more specific to needing that systematic backup. We're also going to be much more aware of and scrutinize the versions of the files that are coming out. We're going to think about safeguards and security. So yes, security is important for any of these systems, but especially so if you are thinking about your preservation system. We need to think about the file integrity or the file health checks. So making sure that the file still has all of its bits that it started with. We need proactive migration when a file obsolescence nears. So we need a system to pay attention or a human to pay attention to what types of file formats you have in your particular file collection and whether those file types are nearing some sort of obsolescence, whether that is the actual software that creates those files is no longer being made, or the particular file, maybe it was open source and there's just not any development further for that particular open source file, that type of thing. And then sometimes a connection to CMS is possible. At least it is becoming more common for us to ask for it, if not having it provided immediately, but being able to reference the preservation system and provide access to those images can sometimes be possible. So is there not a system that does everything? And there is not yet. I really, in my opinion, there should have been one by now, given that we have known about these like data capture, data file management, and digital file preservation needs. Like we've had these needs for decades now. And technology has gotten much better. So I am not sure why our field and the vendors that we work with have not developed a product that does those three things according to best practice. There are, of course, many products out there that may do like it's a CMS primarily, and it maybe kind of does some digital asset stuff or some preservation stuff. There's certainly some overlap, but as of yet, there's not one system I can point to say that one system does it all. You don't need another system after that. Once we do get one, that person is going to make a lot of money. So the challenge for us and the challenge for a lot of organizations, of course, in any sort of not-for-profit sort of setting, there's just not enough resources, let alone staff time to afford one system, let alone like 2 or 3 systems potentially. And that is especially a pain point when those systems don't talk to each other easily. So it just sort of like, in addition to being expensive potentially, it just requires so much brain power and also technical expertise if you have to do that manual connection among the systems. So it's not ideal, and it's so like several different pain points, of which I very much feel and empathize with you all on. So what is the alternative? Considering the choices then, when we are thinking about what sort of system and whether or not we do one or more systems, the first place to start is what is the ultimate goal. So in terms of thinking about our collection, thinking about the risks posed, Thinking about goals for that collection, access is usually a big one. Digital management, digital preservation aspects may also be very high, but needing to go through each of those needs and getting a sense of priority. And then doing a comparison of the system and its jobs. Because some of these systems have overlap into each other, you may find yourself, and many organizations will find themselves in the position where they will have to choose one system that does most of the things. Usually it is choosing a CMS or a DAMS and then finding something to help like shore up that preservation piece. So that said, let me break down this table for you. Across the top, there are 3 columns. First column is CMS, second column is DAMS, third column is preservation systems, but abbreviated. And then going down the left-hand side, top to bottom, the top row is primary job. So that is what the system does. That's what it was made for. Secondary job, something the system does very well, and it usually has some good functionality around, but is not the primary job. Tertiary job, which is it may offer that functionality. It may do it to some extent. That is certainly not its main focus though, so it may not do it as well as you would like. And then on the bottom here, I have a couple different product examples. So if you're not quite familiar with the pantheon of different types of products you could use, you can have a sense for which one is more of a CMS versus a DAMS versus a preservation system. So primary job for the CMS is to capture and manage data. It's about that collections data. The secondary job for the CMS is file attachment. This has now become pretty much a requirement from the field that we're able to attach files to our collection records. So that is now very much majority of the products now have that as an option. The tertiary job is delivering public access. So many of the products now at this point finally do offer a public access piece to their product. For many products, it is still sort of like an afterthought kind of product where you could add it on sort of feeling. And there's also the aspect of yes, it does provide you sort of a public facing website, but for many of them, it can look quite dated because it's not the main focus for the CMS vendors to make it look pretty, unlike when we do shopping or Google searching elsewhere in the internet. It's just something that they've not focused on before, and I am hoping that many of them will redo theirs very soon. For examples, TMS is one of the very prolific ones, especially with the larger institutions. Lucidia's Argus is another very popularly used product, especially for very medium and large size collections. And then, of course, Past Perfect is another example of a collections management system, and one that doesn't necessarily come with a front end as an example. For DAMS, the primary job is file management, which comes with some of that digital preservation management, like the concept of different file versions, but not necessarily always about the file integrity. Its secondary job is to capture data about the files and in the files. Now, this is where we see the difference between something like Dropbox and something like Orange Logic, for example, where for Dropbox, there's not much data capture you can do about the file. That's not really what it's there for. It's more about file collaboration and sharing. Whereas for digital asset management systems, at least the proper product ones, it is about being able to capture data about that file as well. Tertiary job, offering access, sometimes public. Digital asset management, more in my brain at least, sort of comes out of or related to concepts like marketing and communications, where the assets that they create are very much internal, or maybe with a small amount of external people that they would share with. So having that public access piece is usually not a default added on, and instead is usually a much more controlled, much more discrete way of being able to share specific assets. Example products, Orange Logic and NetX, are very specifically digital asset management versus collections management systems. And then finally, for preservation systems, primary job, preserve the files, like that first and foremost, bread and butter. The secondary job is that it does typically capture, at least in like the actual created systems versus free tools, will capture data about the file health and sometimes information about the files. The third job is that we'll offer a version for access. And similar to DAMS, this is going to be extremely limited sort of access because ultimately you don't want a whole bunch of people getting access to your preservation system. The primary job is not providing access, and so that's just not something that it does. Examples of preservation systems specifically focused on preservation versus digital asset management is Archivum and Preservica. There are not a lot of systems out there for our field that are preservation centric. So these are the two main ones that you will hear and see about. I hope that there will be more in our future so we can have more choice. But for the moment, those are the two big ones, at least from my frame of reference. My personal opinion, these are the two I hear most about. So the question back to you then, knowing that we may not want or may not be able to afford 3 different systems, and probably not even 2 different systems, what do we actually need the most? So whether or not that's the collections management system, so manage and provide access to data and the files a little bit, but more about the collection data. Whether it's DAMS, so that management of the digital files or the digital assets, and then sometimes that preservation and that access piece. So this may actually be more applicable to archives if there's like a records retention focus, for example. A DAMS may be more in line with what you're looking for versus a CMS. Or the preservation system, where the job is to preserve digital files, and there's usually like a little bit of data and sometimes a little bit of access. This particular system, if you are an organization where there's not necessarily a public-facing side, you don't need to worry about that access piece. And if it is more about the importance of file preservation, this may be the first system for you to get. So considering the core needs, and can you get away with buying just one? Absolutely, but there's going to be some trade-offs, of course. So whatever you do decide, make sure that it performs at least like the core functions that are of greatest need for you. Take advantage of functions and workflows to help support your organization in the way that it needs, at least to the extent possible. And then if necessary, pick one of the products that meets most of your functions and then pair it with some sort of complementary sort of system or tool that could be free to low cost. For example, Dropbox or Google Drive if you're really hurting for that storage sort of mechanism. Or if we're thinking about digital file preservation as our next greatest pain point, there's Bagit as a tool to consider and take a look at, which is free and open source. Or thinking about AVP Fixity Pro for that preservation piece. And Fixity Pro is, in my opinion, quite affordable for the wonderful tool that it is. So I definitely recommend you check that out. And then thinking usable versus best practice. Like we are always striving towards best practice, but it is a practice. And so much like yoga, many of us will never become perfect yoginis ourselves. It will always be a lifetime of practice. And it's very much the same thing here. While there are all of these best practices and things to keep in mind and to implement, at the end of the day, we are only human and we can only afford as many systems or tools as we can. And it's usually never like the perfect ideal scenario. So with that in mind, focus on the risk mitigation, focus on minimizing the potential loss of those digital files. Do be able to perform basic management functions, thinking about basic descriptive information, of course, and then can it provide a front-facing platform for audience access if that particular piece is important to you. So as you think about those, yes, all of them are important, but how would you rank them? And sometimes that can be a helpful way to determine what systems to look at first. You can do some DIY, some do-it-yourself. In terms of things that are usually within your control or influence is where the file storage happens. So whether it's the file storage device or system, you usually have some sort of influence, if not direct decision making over what storage and where. The file naming conventions is usually completely under your control and is just an easy way to implement and be consistent with that sort of file management piece, as well as that file organization. So there are two of the three that you have direct control over that can help with that management piece and ultimately help with the consistency and accuracy of your digital files. And then continuing with thinking about doing it ourselves, if we are in need of storage, looking at getting things like external hard drives, there are great external hard drives out there. Just keep in mind that they will have a life expectancy, a lifespan, and to budget accordingly for swapping those out. Or if you are going with a system, looking at Google Drive, Dropbox, or similar, very much if you are like you have to get the CMS first, you can afford a DAMS as well, or maybe you don't want a second DAMS necessarily, but you need somewhere to store things. Those are great, great like supplementary option. Services and systems like Backblaze that offer not just the concept of cloud storage like Google Drive or Dropbox, but also offer some more of the system backups and preservation pieces. There's some different service options you could add on that can help outsource some of that need for you. And then for preservation specific, there's Baggit and AVP Fixity Pro. I've got links for these on the resource slide card that you'll see in the near future. Baggit is great for like, I've created this pristine preservation file. I need to put it somewhere and have it be safe. Using Baggit for that purpose is an excellent use of that tool. If you are setting up sort of your own backup sort of system, which is entirely possible, using it and pairing a tool like AVP Fixity Pro to do that file health check for you with wherever you have set up your digital file management is a great sort of complementary do-it-yourself setup that could be very beneficial for you. All right, so we did get a couple good questions in. First question, how can I convey or convince management that digital asset managers are more IT-based and should be classified and paid accordingly? I feel like I don't fit into any other teams and was lumped into a department where there's a small amount of similarities. And then there were a couple follow-ups. Does my position and duties warrant a new team of its own? And how do I advocate for my unique skill set and the benefits I bring to the organization? So great question. Even if it wasn't technology based, I feel like it's a question we can all relate to working in such a specialized field. But some good questions. So let's get into it. So for the first part, how can you convey and convince? Just wanting to affirm your comment where you feel like you don't really fit into any of the teams and you were just sort of like put in a department that's like not really a fit. Unfortunately is very common and is unfortunately a pervasive problem. And this is especially true for organizations that are large enough where they have created the concept or have implemented the concept of classifications. And so they have selected and worked on the more common position classifications. For example, if it was a university, then like they have a librarian classification. They do not necessarily have a digital asset manager classification and could very easily, and I've seen this happen, conflate the two and just assign you a librarian classification. Not to say that there is anything bad about a librarian classification, but it's different jobs, it's different required knowledge, it's different risks that ultimately you are dealing with for this particular area of your work. And so there's some important differences here. So if you are in one of those organizations that uses classifications, I recommend seeking out getting a copy of the classification they've put you under, first of all, and then seeking out similar either government agencies, if that's where you are, or universities or nonprofits that are large enough they have their own classifications, to see if you can find one that is actually a better fit. And even if you're not from one of those organizations, you can find federal classifications available online and can search for and perhaps find something that's more appropriate that you could bring to a conversation as an example. So first stop is figuring out what you've been classified under. And then I would recommend going through the exercise of doing like a document markup in terms of like, none of these apply, add in these requirements in terms of education expertise, adding in responsibility, etc. Can be a great visual for demonstrating that that classification you're in is not accurate. And your next question, does my position and duties warrant a new team of its own? Yes, very likely, especially if you're in a medium to larger size organization and you're doing any sort of digital file management, let alone digital file preservation. There should definitely be one or more likely more team members for this particular focus, especially knowing what's such a large job it can be just in general, thinking about file management and preservation. And then how do I advocate for my unique skill set and the benefits I bring to the organization? So first and foremost is gathering evidence, numbers, and examples. Because depending on who you're talking to, their brain will either be more convinced by numbers or more convinced by like qualitative anecdotes, narrative examples, etc. So get both of those because they will be helpful for your conversation. And I think finding other examples in sort of peer organizations could be very helpful. So finding a digital asset manager person in a different museum, for example, that you can sort of point to as an example of this is what it can look like and this is what this person does, can be very helpful for your case. That said, it ultimately depends on the organization and how open or flexible that organization is to change. But it's not going to change if you don't ask for it either. So I would say definitely start there. Knowing that you're doing digital asset management and knowing that the technical knowledge, expertise, let alone skill set is incredibly important. I would even find some examples from a non-museum, non-archives sector and find position like examples of position descriptions from that sector that basically mirror what you're doing and what your responsibilities are. And hopefully those examples also have salary ranges or indication there, so you can also demonstrate that these skills and knowledge requirements usually come with commensurate compensation. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of giving you some tools and some resources to look for to help make your case. I think you do have a case to make here, so I'll be rooting for you. All right, next question. Could you speak to digital collections management and its carbon footprint? Are there ways we can reduce our footprint? I love this question, and I wish that there was more I could share with you here. I had a fun little, like, going down a rabbit hole moment, wanting to try and answer this question for you, and then realizing how little there is, especially for our field, in discussing the challenge of having some pretty strict and high requirements for digital file management and preservation, and then trying to marry those with also trying to meet reducing carbon emissions, reducing that carbon footprint, reducing energy use with that type of work. Because ultimately, and I am, first of all, not an expert in this particular topic, but from my understanding, helping to minimize the carbon footprint is a game of efficiency. So when we're thinking about the things that we do digital collections management wise, we are doing uploading files, downloading files. We may be streaming files for access to audiovisual content. We may be doing maximum file sizes because preservation and best practice in terms of why we are doing those large file sizes. And ultimately, all of those things that we're doing for digital file management, preservation, and access are all things that contribute towards the carbon footprint. And so when we're trying to introduce efficiency into it, often the recommendations are don't do streaming, limit searches, and like only upload smaller file sizes. And those things are sort of antithetical to the fundamentals we just talked about for almost an hour. So it's a challenge. And for our field specifically, I would love to see some thought leadership in how we can still achieve file management, preservation, and access while being smarter about and thoughtful about reducing that carbon footprint. I think we have opportunity in renewable energy sources and the more availability in being able to implement those at our own organizations, as well as system efficiencies. So one of the things we talked about was you could be looking at a potential of 3 different systems when we're thinking about file management, preservation, and access. As humans, nobody wants 3 different systems. Well, some of us may do because we want things done well. But the concept of having 3 systems is just not a fun one to think about when you could have one great system. So I think system efficiencies also could help us dramatically. So instead of trying to strive for 3 different systems, the systems we use maybe are more motivated to be efficient and offer the functionality we're looking for in one system, or at least cooperate better so that we're not needing 2 or 3 systems. So I'm sorry that there was not like a specific do these 5 things, especially when those 5 things don't fit the content that we just talked about. But hopefully it can help spark some ideas, and maybe we could all put a little bit of pressure on the vendors that we work with to help us be smarter about this, and for all of us to just be more intentional. Resources. All right, so we mentioned AVP's Fixity Pro tool. Go check it out. It is super cool and relatively intuitive, which is not always the case with very technical tools. And if you would like instructions and a demo, the Digital Preservation Coalition, that I believe is based in the UK, created a handbook, which we link to in the slide because it's amazing. But as part of that handbook, they have like a whole little section on Fixity and how to use it. Another resource I want to point you to is the Archivist's Guide to Digital Preservation by Margot Note. She worked with Lucidia Press, and so courtesy of Lucidia, you can download a free e-copy all about digital preservation. There's the Bagit tool that we talked about for those pristine preservation files. Bagit was created by Library of Congress, and all of the The tech and code and info you need is available via GitHub. There are a couple resources: community-owned digital preservation tool registry, otherwise called Copter, and that one is the more updated version of Power, which is preserving digital objects with restricted resources. I have both of them on this slide because it's not like an exact successor of Power, and Power still has some very helpful, like the tool grid that I still use. But Copter is like the next iteration in terms of digital preservation. So got links to both. And then that Digital Preservation Coalition handbook, I've got it linked in here on the slide too, because there's so much good stuff in there. So if you're ready for diving into the more technical and the much more specific for digital collections management, that could be a great resource for you. All right, well, keep in touch if you have any other questions. Otherwise, thank you so much and welcome to fall.